We have major breaking news to tell you about in the case of the United States of America versus Donald J. Trump. With permission from Judge Tanya Chutkan, Special Counsel Jack Smith has released a filing detailing never-before-seen evidence he has compiled against Donald Trump in his investigation of the federal election interference case. It begins with the defense of Jack Smith's entire case in light of the Supreme Court's immunity decision, which divides official acts from private acts, giving presidents immunity for official ones. It reads in part, quote, "The defendant asserts that he is immune from prosecution for his criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election because, he claims, it entailed official conduct. Not so. Although the defendant was the incumbent president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was fundamentally a private one. This motion provides a comprehensive account of the defendant's private criminal conduct. This, quote, comprehensive account of Donald Trump's criminal conduct is 165 pages long. It's here on our desk. We just got it a few minutes ago. Fortunately for us, we have an entire team of experts, lawyers, and reporters combing through it right now from front to back, from back to front. That breaking news is where we start today with former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, Andrew Weissmann. Also joining us, former U.S. Attorney and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman. With me at the table, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. Let me read a little bit more to you all. On page 4, quote, "At its core, the defendant Donald Trump's scheme was a private criminal effort. In his capacity as a candidate, the defendant used deceit to target every stage of the electoral process, which, through the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and state laws, includes the state's notification to the federal government of the selection of their representative electors based on the popular vote in the state, the meeting of those electors to cast their votes consistent with the popular vote, and Congress's counting of the electors' votes at a certification proceeding." At its core, the scheme was a private criminal effort. That feels like one among many of the headlines, Andrew Weissmann.
Nicole, I don't like to jump to something that sounds like hyperbole, but there is no question that there are repeated bombshells in this submission. And I cannot tell you that I've finished the 165 pages. Let me tell you why I think this is so devastating. First, the prosecution recounts direct evidence against the former president. Conversations directly with him by lawyers and by Mike Pence himself. At one point, one of the lawyers tells him that there is no proof of any fraud that would be outcome determinative. That claim to the otherwise, or he uses an expletive, says it's BS. He has recounted conversations with Pence himself, describing that the claims of election fraud that the president is making are not true. So this is direct evidence. There also is direct evidence of the president saying, I don't care about the details. I don't care that we would lose in court. And when he's warned that there would be violence on page 8 of the filing, when he's warned that if he continues this, that there could be violence, he says, make them riot. That's a quote. Make them riot, do it. Those are quotes from the submission in terms of the cavalier attitude of the former president in connection with the anticipated violence. And we all could see on January 6th exactly what happened and the violence that ensued.
Andrew Weissmann, I'll read from that section. In the immediate post-election period, while the defendant, Donald Trump, claimed fraud without proof, his private operatives sought to create chaos rather than seek clarity at polling places where states were continuing to tabulate votes. For example, on November 4th, a campaign employee, agent, and co-conspirator of the defendant tried to sow confusion when the ongoing vote count at the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan, looked unfavorable to the defendant. That's Donald Trump. There, when a colleague at the TCF Center told a redacted witness here, we think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right. The witness responded, find a reason it isn't. give me options to file litigation. And even if it is, when the colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, a violent effort to stop the vote count in Florida after the 2000 presidential election, P5, person 5, responded, quote, make them riot and do it. The defendant's campaign operatives and supporters used similar tactics at other tabulation centers, including in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Andrew Weissmann, it gets at something that the January 6th committee got at and around, and I think they would say all of the evidence they developed was telling this story, but they didn't puncture perhaps the innermost circle, which is Donald Trump's voice. They get at the innermost circle of both premeditation, intent, and state of mind. Talk about that, the power of that evidence.
Absolutely. So that is exactly the limitation, as terrific as the work was of the congressional hearing and how much they did with limited tools. If you recall, Mike Pence did not testify and provide evidence there, nor did certain witnesses come in and say what their direct conversations were with Donald Trump. So they talked around meetings, they talked about certain things that happened, but they would not talk about those direct conversations. What this filing shows is Jack Smith did just that. He has those conversations, direct evidence with respect to the former president, direct knowledge to show that he knew that his claims were false. And I think, that's one where we knew that was going to exist. I find the statements about what he thinks about violence is something that is both devastating for the legal case, and you would know better than I, but from a political case, especially in light of the kind of claims that were made yesterday at the vice presidential debate to sort of sugarcoat and whitewash what happened on January 6th. This has Donald Trump being so incredibly cavalier. Remember, at the time that he is reported to be making these statements, he is the sitting president of the United States. And when he's told about potential violence, it is not how do we prevent it. The quote is, do it, make them riot. So it is just so antithetical to what you do when you are a government official, as Nicole, you have been, and I have been, and Harry has been. That is, you take an oath of office to defend the Constitution, to uphold the law. So those kinds of statements that Jack Smith clearly has are really devastating, I think, both from a legal perspective and then obviously potentially from a political perspective.
Okay, I want to turn the conversation to Pence. I want to bring Lisa Rubin in, who just gasped upon reading something on page 142. I'll share what you read that made you gasp, and then let's dive into what we know to be new, and that is Mike Pence's voice on all of this. What we had were our eyeballs on Mike Pence's movements on that day. What we had were our ears on the sound of actually a disguised voice testifying before the January 6th Select Committee about the calls, the kinds of calls that came into the sit room back at the White House from Mike Pence's security detail. But we didn't know much in Mike Pence's own voice. We didn't know what he would say under oath as a witness in a criminal proceeding. But now we do. Let me read to you. I'll read first what made Lisa Rubin gasp. Why make everybody wait? From page 142, quote, upon receiving a phone call alerting him, Donald Trump, that Pence had been taken to a secure location, witness P15 rushed to the dining room to inform the defendant, Donald Trump, in hopes that the defendant, Donald Trump, would take action to ensure Mike Pence's safety. Instead, after this person delivered the news, the defendant, Donald Trump, looked at him and said only, quote, so what? Lisa?
The cavalierness with which Donald Trump received that news certainly is news to me, and it goes to Andrew's point about a number of the allegations here not being just things we've seen before in the January 6th committee and in the transcripts that were generated by that committee's investigation. There's a whole lot of new content here, Nicole, and that is just one part of it. I want to also talk about the fact that while much of the public focus is going to be on the interactions between Trump and Pence and Pence as a witness before the government. There is so much else here outside of Pence, so that even if a higher court at a later point decides that those conversations really are off limits, it doesn't change the fact that, for example, there are huge chunks of this brief that talk about things that are solely outside the executive branch entirely, including a many-page-long section about Trump's outreach to officials in other states, including his infamous phone call to Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, his meeting with the two heads of the Michigan state houses in the White House, a call to then Speaker of the Arizona State House, Rusty Bowers, a call to Chris Carr, the then and current Attorney General of Georgia, and, of course, the infamous call to Brad Raffensperger. There's also a huge section on the fake electors scheme, which was largely perpetrated by people outside government, including then chair of the Republican National Committee, Ronna McDaniel, and Rudy Giuliani, as well as others. So I think the focus publicly today is properly on Pence because there's so much about that we don't know. But in terms of thinking about what the right legal outcome here should be, I want to make sure that people understand that there is so much here that is solely private in its nature that Trump and his team of lawyers can't get around. They may have delayed the ultimate judgment day, and depending on the outcome of the election, there may be no judgment day. But in a real court upholding the rule of law, there is a plethora of conduct here that is purely private and outside that presidential immunity ruling that should see the light of day at trial.
And
that point about the sort of drama in the document and the narrative arc of it, specifically the pressure on Pence, which comes through in the January 6th committee report a bit, and is really a focus here that, on January 5th, the defendant told Pence, I think you have the power to decertify. When Pence was unmoved, the defendant threatened to criticize him publicly, which, again, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know what that means. I'm going to have to say you did a great disservice. And then this timing with it's possible, again, it's easy to lose track of what has been entered into the public record and what hasn't, Rachel, but this timing of that tweet, and we played you, I think that's Nick Fuentes, the notorious Nazi who dined with the president in the Bullhorn, reading out about Pence not doing what he's called to do. At 2:24 p.m., Trump was alone in the dining room when he issued a tweet attacking Pence and fueling the ongoing riot. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones, which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. And then, Jack Smith writes, 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Pence to a secure location. Rachel, it doesn't quite say cause and effect, but it just lays the cause and the effect right there next to each other in adjacent sentences.
There's so much detail that they are presenting about that tweet and the context of it. They go to great lengths in great detail to explain that Trump was alone in the dining room off the Oval Office when he sent it. They go to great lengths to say that, yes, there was another staffer who did have was sort of cleared to tweet in Trump's name, but he did not do that tweet. They go to great lengths to show that at the time that Trump sent that tweet, while he was alone and nobody else was there, it was definitely him who did it. He was both watching Fox News, which had already reported at that point and was continually reporting that the Capitol had been breached, that the rioters had made their way inside Congress where Mike Pence was. He was also watching Twitter where it was being reported in real time. I mean, they are saying, they go through all of those details like it was him and this is what he knew when he did it. And then they establish, some of the other things that he tweeted around the election and around January 6th, arguably under the Supreme Court's rules around these things could be construed as official actions. When he did send statements in a sort of milquetoast way that said people should go home in peace and love, that was a kind of presidential thing to do. He was acting on the institutional interest of the U.S. government.
Presidential-ish.
But when he said Mike Pence... Yes, but when he said Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what needed to be done, there's nothing presidential about it. There is no way that this could be construed as doing anything other than advancing his personal, private, criminal interest in that moment. They just cover every single angle of it in a way that it just feels like a straitjacket.
There's also something, I mean, you made this mention before, Rachel. I mean, and we were sitting together, Lawrence, on the day of that immunity, both oral arguments and decision. You know, this effort basically, a largely successful effort in certain ways, aided by the Supreme Court, right, to make all this just disappear down the memory hole. Right? As we sit here 34 days from an election in which we all know, everyone who covers this, everyone in politics, Democrat, Republican, across the ideological spectrum, understands that he's going to try to do the same thing again. That's obviously a certainty, right? And so this part, which seemed relevant today, and particularly relevant after at your very funny line last night about J.D. Vance being the first vice presidential nominee not to know who won the previous election. The defendant and his co-conspirators also demonstrated their deliberate disregard for the truth when they repeatedly changed the numbers. I love this. Changed the numbers in their baseless fraud allegations from day to day. The conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in Arizona. 5 days later, it was beyond credulity that a few 100,000 didn't vote. 3 weeks later, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000.
So the timing of this, less than 24 hours after we saw J.D. Vance on the debate stage, unable to answer the question of did Donald Trump lose the election, and J.D. Vance having publicly already said he would not have done what Mike Pence did. He would have done exactly. Donald Trump would only have to ask him once. Yeah. In fact, might not even have to ask him.
He might do it proactively. Yes.
Right. And then for this document to emerge today, where the star of today's document is Mike Pence, because he hasn't been in anything else we've been able to read. So this really is Mike Pence's moment in this story today. And every single step of this story that Mike Pence is in, Mike Pence is doing and saying the right thing every time. He's saying and doing what he was elected to do, what his oath of office told him to do, which is when Donald Trump says to him, you really should do this, every single time, he says no, every single time.
Against interest and, of course, against the political pressure. Rachel.
I just wanted to jump in there and just follow sort of in the shadow of what Lawrence just said there. You noted, Chris, like it's kind of hard to keep track of what's in the public record. And Lawrence was saying this sort of feels like the screenplay version. This helps you connect different things. One of the things that I never connected before, it's something that's described on page 63 of this document. We knew from Pence's memoir that when he was really making clear as of New Year's Day, as of January 1st, that he was not going to go along with this, that all the lobbying of him was not working. We know from his memoir that Trump threatened him and said, quote, hundreds of thousands of people are, quote, gonna hate your guts. We knew that he had done that. What I did not know before reading this today is that he's threatening them that hundreds of thousands of people are going to effectively come after him for what he's doing here. And then immediately after he says that to Pence, immediately afterwards, he tweets a reminder to all of his supporters to make sure you're going to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. I mean, when he makes that threat to Pence, he's already announced, we'll be wild. Everybody come for January 6th. He tells him hundreds of thousands of people are going to come for you. And then he hits a reminder in Twitter telling people that they need to show up so that he can make good on the threat. It is just wielding the promise of an angry mob as a deliberate threat and as one that he is planning to make good on. And I've never seen it laid out that way before, even though I knew the individual pieces of it. And it just sent a chill down my spine.
Yeah, and Rachel, that dialogue that you pointed out there's a key line at the end which would play to a jury so perfectly. When Donald Trump is saying to Mike Pence, you really got to do this, Pence saying he's not going to do it, and then he's telling Pence, people are going to be very disappointed in you. His last line to Mike Pence is, you're too honest. That tells you what Donald Trump thinks the truth is. Yes. That Mike Pence is actually telling the truth. You're too honest, Mike Pence.
Yes, you're too honest being an admission of guilt.
So state of mind for Donald Trump exists throughout the document, including in the present, in those moments, you're too honest. But they carry the state of mind proof years after the fact, right up to 2023, right up to last year, where they're quoting Donald Trump, praising the people who attacked the Capitol, calling them martyrs, calling them heroes, calling them patriots, raising money for, it specifies that he raises money for them, that he praises them at his campaign events, that he plays their song at the campaign events. That's all goes into Donald Trump's mind about what he was actually doing and how willful it was.
One of the things that shows up here, Rachel, to what you just said, Lawrence, about all the stuff he's done subsequently about these folks who are his people. I mean, from signing the backpack of the woman who came to the event, to the J6 choir creepy song being played at the rally, to the promises of pardons, which essentially none of that is explicitly that stuff criminal activity, and Smith isn't alleging it is, but to show it's essentially a continuation of of what was happening in the run-up and the aftermath.
Yeah, and page 100, you've heard today it's a 165-page document. There's a whole lot of stuff that is still redacted that we haven't seen at all, appendices to this document, which may yet be released, and who knows when that will be. But towards the very end of this 165-page document, page 162 and 163, they explicitly say that his post-presidential statements go to explain his intent, his endorsements of the violent actions of his supporters in an ongoing way, and the promises of pardons, and lionizing them, and celebrating them, and justifying it. Those things may be distasteful but not criminal, unless it is being used as part of the criminal case against you, because it shows that you were encouraging their actions, believed in their actions, and were on their side and trying to use them as a lever in your personal crimes.
It's not, I think, particularly useful or edifying for me to say this, but I'll say it, which is that it did make me enraged at the Supreme Court all over again. I mean, the degree to which the plain facts of this, everything that's been established, all of the due diligence that's been done, all of the investigative work, all the things we know, everything we saw happen in real time, the impeachment, the Jan 6 committee, that it was all there and should have been essentially prosecuted like a normal crime, is not happening. This is what we have, and I'm glad we have it, but it is an outrage to me.
I would recommend saving some rage for their next decision on this very same
Well, that's a good point.
Because whatever Judge Chutkan
have some in the tank.
Here, the Trump side is going to appeal her decision on this. It's going to go to the appeals court. The appeals court is going to rule however they rule, and then it's going to go to the Supreme Court. And so they're going to have Supreme Court's going to get another look at this, at the way Jack Smith has presented this evidence.
Rachel.
But importantly, when they do that, they will at least be unable to run away from the factual contentions as laid out by Jack Smith, right? I mean, one of the things that was most enraging about both the oral argument and the ruling by Chief Justice Roberts in the immunity case was they kept saying, whatever the facts are here, like, we don't need to engage with what actually happened here. This is just high-minded constitutional thinking that we're doing here. We don't need to get into the specifics of what actually happened. Well, yeah, you do, because your ridiculous immunity ruling makes us have to parse every individual action to decide whether it's capital O official or lowercase o official or not official at all in this bizarre system that you made up. But that means we need to go through the facts of every single one of these things. And here's the factual record. And him saying, so what, when he was confronted with the physical peril that he had put his vice president in. Here's him saying the details don't matter when he's told by his own legal counsel that what he is proposing is illegal and will not stand up in court. I mean, the factual record here is for the public, but it's also to, I think, ultimately embarrass those justices if they want to keep this charade going through another round of appeals.
Well, the Vice President of the United States was taking notes. Donald Trump always hated seeing people take notes in the White House when he was speaking. But taking notes was the least of Donald Trump's problems with Mike Pence during a meeting in which the President of the United States was trying to get the Vice President of the United States to join what Jack Smith calls a criminal conspiracy and commit a crime against the United States of America, a crime that Special Prosecutor Jack Smith, in a 165-page motion today, calls a conspiracy against the rights of millions of Americans to vote and have their votes counted. It was January 4th, 2021. The discussion was one of several described in Jack Smith's filing today, in which Donald Trump tried to get Mike Pence to throw out the Electoral College results of the votes cast by every voter in America. This is about every vote cast in that election. Throwing out the results of 7 states would mean not just that the votes in those states didn't matter, but that no votes in any states mattered in deciding who the next president would be. It meant that your vote would not matter, no matter where you cast your vote. It was a meeting about whether Mike Pence had the constitutional authority to just throw out Electoral College votes on January 6th when they are officially accepted by Congress. It was a legal discussion, but no one from the White House counsel's office was present, not invited by Donald Trump. The lawyer arguing for Donald Trump in that meeting was the now indicted John Eastman, who is facing criminal charges in Georgia and Arizona for his alleged crimes of election interference in those states. In Jack Smith's filing today, John Eastman is referred to as co-conspirator 2, and Donald Trump is referred to as the defendant. During the meeting, the defendant asked co-conspirator 2 to explain his plan to Pence. Co-conspirator 2 presented 2 options. Pence could unilaterally decide objections to electors, or alternatively, in the plan that co-conspirator 2 had devised the prior day, Pence could send the elector states to the targeted states legislatures to determine which electors' votes should be counted. In the defendant's presence, in response to Pence's questioning, co-conspirator 2 admitted that the Electoral Count Act forbade what he proposed and that no one had tested co-conspirator 2's new plan to send elector states back to the states. Nonetheless, the defendant repeatedly expressed a preference that state legislatures do the review. Pence unilaterally would unilaterally reject valid elector states. Throughout the meeting, the defendant repeated his knowingly false fraud claims as a purported basis for Pence to act illegally. Pence's 5 pages of contemporaneous notes from the meeting reflect that. The defendant said, when there's fraud, the rules get changed. Bottom line, won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes. This whole thing is up to Mike Pence. Has to do with you. You can be bold and right to do whatever you want to do. The meeting concluded with Pence, firm and clear, telling the defendant, I'm not seeing this argument working. Nonetheless, the defendant requested that Pence's staff meet with co-conspirator 2 again to discuss further, and Pence agreed. The next day, January 5th, there was a rerun of the same discussion. During the meeting, the defendant once again told Pence, I think you have the power to decertify. When Pence was unmoved, the defendant threatened to criticize him publicly. I'm going to have to say you did a great disservice. That provoked Pence's staff to alert the vice president's Secret Service detail that Donald Trump was going to publicly attack Mike Pence. Donald Trump followed that meeting with a couple of phone calls to Mike Pence saying, you've got to be tough tomorrow. Donald Trump tried to put public pressure on Mike Pence by tweeting lies like, all Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage. Donald Trump's last attempt to personally convince Mike Pence to commit a crime was 11:15 a.m. on January 6th. At 11:15 a.m., shortly before traveling to the Ellipse to speak to his supporters, the defendant called Pence and made one last attempt to induce him to act unlawfully in the upcoming session, when Pence again refused and told the defendant that he intended to make a statement to Congress before the certification proceeding confirming that he lacked the authority to do what the defendant wanted. The defendant was incensed. He decided to reinsert into his campaign speech at the Ellipse remarks targeting Pence for his refusal to misuse his role in the certification, and the defendant set into motion the last plan in furtherance of his conspiracies. If Pence would not do as he asked, the defendant needed to find another way to prevent the certification of Biden as president. When the defendant took the stage at the Ellipse rally to speak to the supporters who had gathered there at his urging, he knew that Pence had refused once and for all to use the defendant's fraudulent electors' certificates. The defendant also knew that he had only one last hope to prevent Biden's certification as president: the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. So for more than an hour, the defendant delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters and motivate them to march to the Capitol. The rest is history, and as described by Jack Smith, a crime against the United States of America like no other in our history. Last night, the United States of America learned beyond a reasonable doubt just how eager Donald Trump's next vice president would be to commit the crime Mike Pence repeatedly refused to commit.
Look, when Mike Pence made that decision to certify that election, that's why Mike Pence isn't on this stage.
Senator Vance, you have said you would not have certified the last presidential election and would have asked the states to submit alternative electors. That has been called unconstitutional and illegal. Would you again seek to challenge this year's election results, even if every governor certifies the results? I'll give you 2 minutes.
Well, Nora, first of all, I think that we're focused on the future. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future.
That is a damning non-answer.
November's coming very quickly. We've heard Liz Cheney go out there and go all the way from opposition to Donald Trump to now actively saying, yes, you have to. She believes the right vote is actually to vote for Kamala Harris. Where is your thinking on how you're going to vote?
I've known for quite a long time, number one, that I would never in my life vote for Donald Trump ever
That you made
again.
clear. That you did make clear. Yeah.
I hope so. Thank you for acknowledging that. I have also known for a long time, whether the nominee was at one point going to be Joe Biden, now Kamala Harris, that I was going to cast my vote for either candidate, now Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. In my personal view, now I understand that the way that people approach the way that they decide who to vote for is oftentimes deeply intimate and personal, so I don't ever want to try to tell somebody how to vote. But in my experience, number one, from being up close to Donald Trump, seeing his character, knowing who he is, believing him when he tells us who he is, and also who he chose as his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, who's a whole separate conversation. It's just a despicable portrayal of the Republican Party. I am really, really proud as a conservative to have the opportunity to vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in this election. Policy is important. It's very important to me. And there may be few issues that Kamala Harris and I would see eye to eye on. I hope that we'd be able to come to consensus on a lot more issues. But in saying that, the character of our leaders really matters too. We need to be able to elect people that we can trust to uphold our rule of law, people that we want our children to look at and to want to emulate. Kamala Harris is from a working class background. Tim Walz is from a working class background. Those are the people that Donald Trump claimed to represent, but actually exploited and manipulated their support. So, I say to Republicans who may be on the fence, I understand how frightening it can be to potentially break with your party. I also understand that there are concerns, and very valid concerns, about inflation. But Donald Trump and J.D. Vance cannot be trusted with the Constitution. They cannot be trusted to uphold our rule of law, and they can't be trusted to enact responsible policy. That in and of itself is disqualifying amongst many other things, some of them being that Donald Trump is also under federal and state indictments. So when it comes down to the decision for me to vote for Kamala Harris, I look forward to casting my ballot for her. And I think it's also really important to say, for me at least, that I will also be voting for Democrats in the House and the Senate too, just because I think it is so important that we get past this period of Donald Trump for America to begin healing. And once we're past that period, hopefully we can open up responsible policy debates in the future. But right now, we need to focus on defeating Donald Trump.
Why didn't you answer the question last night during the debate about who won the 2020 presidential election?
Here's the simple reason. The media is obsessed with talking about the election of 4 years ago. I'm focused on the election of 33 days from now.
J.D. Vance may be interested in moving on, but a newly unsealed filing from the special counsel is keeping Trump's increasingly desperate plans to overturn the 2020 election very much in the spotlight 34 days before Election Day as voting is underway in 29 states. Trump himself responded tonight on Truth Social, writing, "Democrats are weaponizing the Justice Department against me because they know I am winning, and they are desperate to prop up their failing candidate, Kamala Harris." The DOJ pushed out this latest hit job today because J.D. Vance humiliated Tim Walz last night in the debate. The DOJ has become nothing more than an extension of Joe's and now Kamala's campaign. Joining me now are Tim Miller, writer-at-large at Bulwark, and Charlie Sykes, an MSNBC contributor and columnist. Gentlemen, here we have it. This is how you explain it away. Tim, this is the weaponization of the Justice Department. Never mind that Judge Tanya Chutkan is an independent federal judge. This is all Joe Biden's master plan. Your thoughts?
Amazing how weaponization works, isn't it, Alex? I mean, they're going after Hunter Biden and Eric Adams and Bob Menendez just to throw us off the scent, I think. I don't know. Look, we know that this is ridiculous from Trump. To me, I think that the most interesting thing that we learned in the filing is just how much Jack Smith has about Donald Trump's behavior on the day of January 6th. And I think the January 6th committee did such a great job that, some of us, I didn't know how much more material would be out there. Just kind of scanning what we've seen so far, knowing what Trump was, what he was watching on his phone, as the riot was occurring, what the context was of when he sent out the Mike Pence should have the courage tweet, the fact that people told him about the threats to Mike Pence and that he didn't care. There is even additional information here added on top of the already damning stuff that we learned from the January 6th committee. And so hopefully, between that and what we saw from J.D. Vance last night, kind of continuing to keep the story in the news as it should be, by refusing to say that Donald Trump lost the election, it can be something that is injected into the public debate in a way that, a certain demographic of people, probably not the viewers of this show, but a certain demographic of people, hasn't been top of mind.
Yeah, Charlie, there's the reality of how damning this is for any former president, but the fact that this person is running again, that election day is in 33 days, I've lost count, and he's out there saying this, let's play the sound of his, his level of confidence about the coming election. Do we have the sound? Can we play it?
Trust the process this time around.
I'll let you know in about 33 days.
Process, Charlie, I'll let you know in about 33 days. That is not what you want to hear from the guy who has who is the subject of a 165-page filing detailing his desperate measures to subvert democracy. I wonder if you think this matters to voters.
Well, we're going to find that out. But you know what? You're going to be hearing a lot more of this because this filing by Jack Smith is a reminder of what Donald Trump did, his criminal conspiracy, his frauds and his deceit and his reliance on violence. But it's also a warning because Donald Trump intends to do it again. And I think that is one of the reasons why this is, really on fire. But also, and you were mentioning just the juxtaposition of the story that the news gods gave us today. With what J.D. Vance said last night, because Jack Smith's filing explains why J.D. Vance was on that platform last night and not Mike Pence. And it is precisely because J.D. Vance is willing to do what Mike Pence refused to do. And the dramatic takeaway I have from reading this 165-page document is the incredible pressure that was put on Mike Pence, all of the threats, all of the cajoling, all of the lies that were told to and about Mike Pence. And then that decision that Mike Pence made that for the first time as vice president, he was not going to do Donald Trump's bidding. He's gone now. He has been excommunicated by Trump world, and J.D. Vance is there in his place. And I think this is what we ought to focus on, is that J.D. Vance, last night with his non-answer, really confirmed that, yeah, listen, look at the narrative of how Donald Trump tried to overturn that election and the role that Mike Pence played. And the reason that Mike Pence is not on that ticket, but J.D. Vance is on that ticket. So one of the things that I think that Jack Smith has done is he has taken the whole January 6th story out of the memory hole that it has been in for the last few weeks, and he's placed it right in front of the voters. Whether or not they're going to consider this old news, we don't know. But the details in this report are dazzling. The narrative is clear, it is compelling, and it is written in such a way that I think non-lawyers can go through it and ask themselves, how is it even conceivably possible that Donald Trump could be president of the United States again? It is a remarkable story, and it is a remarkable reminder of the stakes of this election.
Yeah, when we talk about the relevance of the 2020, the Capitol riots, Tim, it's often seen, as I think Charlie so rightly points out, as something that happened in the rear view. But there is a new level of urgency when you see just how much of a supplicant J.D. Vance is to Donald Trump. I mean, the juxtaposition of his comments last night, Tim Walz saying, where is the firewall? And then this report, honestly, I don't even think you need to read the report. It's just a reminder that, like, oh, yeah, that guy tried to steal the election, and the only guy that stood in his way is now gone. I just wonder if our calculation about how much this matters, how much it's an urgent matter for voters, changes a little bit. Maybe if it's just on the margins, given, the last 24 hours.
Yeah, I was a lot there. I mean, look, the Jim Comey letter, for example, that was old news too, and it changed things on the margins. Won't know whether that was the decisive thing that happened in 2016, not to trigger anybody, but there are late-breaking deciders. We've seen this in both of the 2016 and 2020 elections. People that don't really like either candidate decide really late. It's a small group of people, but it can be a decisive group of people. And I just think as far as the forward versus back element to this, just two things quickly. One, the thing that I was frustrated didn't get mentioned last night in the exchange with J.D. Vance was it isn't just a backwards-looking thing, because J.D. Vance's boss wants to pardon the perpetrators of who are in jail of the 2020 riot. So it is a forward-looking thing. It's part of their agenda. It's a key part of their forward-looking agenda. Donald Trump talks about it all the time. And secondly, I think as Charlie very astutely points out, like this is an ongoing effort. Looking to the 2024 election, I talked to Jim Messina for the Bulwark this morning. He's doing a super PAC called Democracy Defenders. He's working on. You would be astonished at how much effort is going in right now to gum up the works in all of the key swing states by Republican officials who are trying to learn lessons from what happened in 2020. So, this is absolutely a forward-looking issue, not a backwards-looking one.
Charlie, for the, handful of voters who are maybe former Nikki Haley supporters or just Republicans who need to be reminded once more why they should not be voting for Donald Trump, do you think it would be effective for Vice President Harris to talk about this in whatever way legally she is allowed to on the campaign trail?
Yes, absolutely. And I think she will. In fact, tomorrow here in Wisconsin, she's going to be at an event with Liz Cheney. And I'm guessing that this issue is going to come up. And it will be aimed, I think, at Republicans, wavering soft Republicans who have to look at this and say, do we want to go through this again? Do we really want to have another replay of all of this? And especially when you have to confront the evidence that Donald Trump actually was leading a conspiracy that would have resulted in vaporizing tens of millions of votes, including the votes of millions of Wisconsinites. That part of the plot was to have Mike Pence actually gavel in Donald Trump as the winner of the election, accepting the fake electors. When people have to confront that, I really think that there's going to be a sliver, who knows how much of the electorate, that is going to say, okay, we may not like all of Kamala Harris's policies, but this is beyond the pale. This man is not fit for any office of public trust, much less being returned to the Oval Office.
Tim Miller and Charlie Sykes, guys, it's great to have your perspective on this. Thanks for your time tonight.
You said to me, I've been to high school civics class. Why did you say that?
Because if anybody took high school civics class, they'd know what the vice president can do and what the vice president can do. I want to make a quick point. Neither candidate on that stage talked about what executive action they're going to take on day one to do what they want, nor were they asked, because they know that they can't. That's not how the vice presidency works. You don't get to do what you want. You do what the president delegates you to do.
That is Marcus Johnson, a student at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, the internet's choice for the winner of last night's debate and our next guest. Marcus was taking part in a post-debate voter panel with NBC's own Jacob Soboroff when he dismantled one of the many bad faith arguments made by J.D. Vance, the idea that Kamala Harris should implement her policies right now. When a quick civics lesson reminds you she's vice president, the same job that you're auditioning for, Mr. Vance. Marcus Johnson joins me now. Marcus, I have to tell you, you got more attention and I have more texts about you than I think anything else that happened last night. How have you responded to your new internet fame?
I won't lie to you, I didn't find out too much about it until last night when a bunch of people kept yelling at me, Marcus, you're on Reddit, you're on Reddit. I'm like, oh, how fun. I went to my dorm room and I went to sleep. That was enough for me. I wake up this morning, I got a bazillion notifications on X. My best friend texted me up the wazoo. It's been nuts. And still to this day, all I did, I went to class. I got stuff to do. Okay. I don't have time to worry about everybody else.
I need to know, what are you studying? I know that you're a member of the Student Congress at Oakland University. You're the Speaker of the Legislature. That makes sense. Number one, where did you learn such great civics, and what are you studying?
I'm studying political science, if at all that's a surprise. See, naturally. As far as where I learned civics, naturally, if I go with my own talking point, it was in high school. Shout out to Miss Chase, my civics teacher. Other than that, I just pay attention every now and again. I've actually am one of the rare people that have looked at the Constitution every now and again, so I get a lot of my civics knowledge from there.
So if somehow we were able to convince Vice President Harris to do a town hall at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, I have to ask you, Marcus, would you co-host with me?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think it would be great.
Y'all get my number. I'll sign up for it right now.
Let's do it. And let me ask you this. What are some of the questions you think your generation has that you have not seen answered at this moment by either of the candidates?
Ooh, that's a fun question, because I'm thinking about all the different things people have been coming up to me, telling me, and I wish they would talk about this. I wish they would talk about that.
Yeah.
And I won't lie to you, of all the things I hear a lot of people saying, everybody's worried about immigration is not on the top of the list.
Yeah.
But you also got to remember, we a bunch of college students. We worried about, paying for class. Is my debt going to be here for another million years? I have a bunch of friends that are in the transgender community who are still wondering if they're going to have rights at the end of this election. One of them, who was interviewed on NBC, has been dealing with so much cyberbullying by these idiots and trolls is nonsense. So I've got friends who are too focused on whether or not they're going to have rights at the end of this election to be focused on much else. So I think hearing that, it's hopeful for a lot of people, but focusing a lot on that. I've heard someone earlier mention that it might be good for Vice President Harris to focus less on hinging on Donald Trump and what he's doing and this, that, the third, and focus on her, which a lot of people I've talked to, they'd love to hear more about her. I can sit here and drone on and on about her record from here to Kingdom Come, but I can only do so much. They want to hear from her. I say they should.
It is not Friday, but you won the week, my friend. You had 100 followers when this thing started. It's 12,000 and going now. It is at MarcusJ_3194. Get this young brother to 1 million. He deserves it. Marcus Johnson. It's not even Friday, but you won the week, my friend. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.